Good day everyone. This is Group 3 composed of Leonard Baitlon, Frances Arucan, and yours truly. And today, we are going to present to you the contemporary poetry. Let us begin with what contemporary poetry is not. First, contemporary poetry is not found on social networking websites. Second, it is not a coping mechanism for whiny teens. Third, it is not a string of words stuck together without thoughts. Fourth, it is not without rules and guidelines. Lastly, it is not the same thing as modern song lyrics. Of all the definitions that I have already given you, am I able to let you think of what contemporary poetry really is? I hope I am. Technically speaking, contemporary poetry is defined as poetry written after the start of 1920s. It is a poetry which has to do with modern literary genres such as modernism and postmodernism. After knowing the technical definition of contemporary poetry, let us now proceed to its characteristics. Contemporary poetry is often written in free verse. If we say free verse, it is unrhymed and it is without specific metrical rhythm. Second, readers know and can associate with the language. Third, it is brief. Fourth, the poet laces the poem with images using all the senses of the readers. Lastly, it invites the readers to interpret the poem without telling the true meaning of it.
It is created in the last decade of history. Some experts put their start about 100 years ago, while most put as starting point at the end of the World War II, more or less from 1950. Although there are regional differences, the second half of the 20th century appears as the period in which this poetry begins. Okay, so the years after the Second World War, they are marked by the tragic consequences of it. And you know what? Art also responds to this context. Thus, poetry in these early years acquires an existential theme, giving priority to a feeling of emptiness and thinking that life is absurd. As for the authors, many scholars consider that it is modernist Ruben Dario who acts as a frontier towards contemporary poetry, given the changes he introduced with respect to what was done in the 19th century. So, similarly, with Chilean Vicente Huidobro, is another reference to indicate the arrival of the contemporary age of this art. So, in the year 1960s, the theme of contemporary poetry is changing with the emergence of new authors and the remoteness of the global conflict. A part of the authors begins to write a socially committed poetry. Among them, Gabriel Calleja and Blas de Otero stand out. And meanwhile, there is another current that tries to write about the human being, about their concerns and values, but without any kind of relationship with politics. Free verse. Free verse is a verse whose meter is irregular in some point, in some respect, or whose rhythm is not metrical, but you know what, this has still rules and limitations.
Free verse is affiliated with contemporary poetry in the sense that it extends beyond the overarching framework of conventional and traditional poetry. However, what qualifies a poem as contemporary is not constrained within its freeness or modernity, but rather by the context of its era. In this section of our presentation about contemporary poetry, we will explore the characteristics and significance of free verse, as well as some archives and literary references that support the topic of discussion. There are 7 characteristics of free verse, and the first characteristic encapsulates free verse as a living medium. The term contemporary generally refers to something that is happening and living at the same time as we are. Therefore, free verse poetry as a living medium is something that is occurring now, but has been created for a long time as we go through our daily lives. Free verse entails new ideas and experimentation. In contrast to the artificial constraints of traditional poetry, this type of poem is often derived from natural pauses and rhythmical phrases. because it is free from the limitations of regular meter or rhythm and does not rhyme with fixed forms, free verse is nonetheless dynamic and progressive. Sunas Mended is one of the best examples of a free verse poetry. Written by John Ashbery, who was recognized as one of the greatest 20th century American poets, Sunas Mended is a poem that explores alienation, learning the lessons of life, and a portrayal of a stunning sublimation of self. In this poem, there is no regular rhyme scheme or rhythm. It is without poetic constraints, but has a flow that gives it a natural touch. It is 71 lines long and divided into 2 stanzas, with majority of the lines being long and packed with Ashbery's typical mix of mildly philosophical questioning and answering, metaphorical musing, and allusions to popular culture. Therefore, generally speaking, whatever trajectory the poem is headed to, an author of contemporary poetry is in control of paving the path of its purpose and deciding on the boundaries that it chooses to overcome. Free verse has an expressive capacity different from traditional poetry. In terms of their structure and context, contemporary and traditional poetry are always compared and contrasted. Consequently, these two eras are at the forefront of debates due to their notable distinctions, similarities, and contributions to the literary world. When we take a closer look at the compositions of the traditional poets, such as William Shakespeare, the first thing that piques the audience's interest is the archaic language in his poems. For example, Shakespeare's canonical poem entitled Sonnet 18 is formed as part of the Alliance, but is numerical. Its alternate rhyme scheme, AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, which concludes the couplet, and its 14-line long with a turn in its 8th line, are the elements that indicate the poem's form as a sonnet. Apart from the aforementioned characteristics, another feature of free verse is that it must use the same poetic tools as traditional poetry. On a contemporary outlook, imagery, metaphor, simile, conceits, and rhythm are also present. The occurrence of internal rhymes, which are words within a line or verse of a poem that rhyme with each other, are also notable on some of the contemporary poems. Take, for example, this line on Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary. So the words dreary and weary rhyme with each other. Modernists also developed alternative rhyming, such as slant rhyming. Slant or off-rhyme are regarded as imperfect rhymes with words that are similar but not identical in sounds. Modern authors use this because apparently, 1. It creates cohesiveness, 2. It creates an interesting hook on their compositions, and 3. It extends creative expression, whether in prose or poetry. Alteration, consonance, assonance, and onomatopoeia are also included in the features of free verse. Contemporary or free verse poetry has a creative use of white space. A concrete example of this would be the creative and seemingly normal pause in A Noiseless Patient Spider, written by the father of free verse English poetry itself, Walt Whitman. Free verse is not without rules. So ironically, free verse is also governed by some rules and limitations, which shows how complex and dynamic contemporary poetry is. Free verse is also advocated by numerous professionals. And the last characteristic of free verse is that some free verse are absolutely better than others. So, although writers are abundant with creative inspirations to put into their compositions, some would inevitably exceed or rather qualify to the standards of the majority. Free verse, with its freedom and structural looseness, provides an exceptional amount of expressive potential with a rhythmic meter, alternative rhyme schemes, all while paying close attention to subtle poetic tools and various literary overtones, making it an optimal style for poets and professional writers.